All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be doing a deep dive into MicroStrategy.
Oh, really interesting company.
Yeah, and we're really focusing on how they're using Bitcoin. And we've got a great article that lays out some of their, I don't know, creative, shall we say,
Unconventional.
yeah, unconventional financial strategies involving things like issuing shares and convertible bonds.
It's really fascinating how they're really trying to position themselves as leaders in this whole Bitcoin space, right? Like
Yeah.
they want to be the company you think of when you think of innovative financial practices in the cryptocurrency world, specifically with Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that jumped out at me, right, and this is something that I think a lot of people who follow companies, maybe in more traditional markets, will be familiar with, is this concept of share dilution, right? Which usually is seen as a negative, but MicroStrategy is kind of like flipping the script on that, huh?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because normally when a company issues more shares, it can decrease the value of existing shares. Right. It's like,
Mm,
you imagine you have a pie and you keep cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces.
yeah, yeah.
But MicroStrategy is saying, yeah, we're issuing more shares, but we're using that money to buy Bitcoin. And because we believe Bitcoin is going to go up in value, it actually increases the value backing each share over time. So it's kind of like they're growing the pie at the same time they're cutting it into more pieces.
The article had this great example that helped me understand this. Let's say they issued 10 new shares at $300 each to raise $3,000. And then they immediately use that money to buy Bitcoin.
Right.
So, yeah, okay, now there are twice as many shares out there. But if that Bitcoin they bought doubles in price, well, the Bitcoin backing each share has actually increased as well, right?
Exactly, and that's the bet they're making. It's a calculated risk, for sure, but it shows just how strongly they believe in the long-term potential of Bitcoin.
And then there's the other piece of this, the convertible bonds, which the way they're using them is, well, pretty unusual.
Yeah, so convertible bonds, for those who maybe aren't familiar, it's basically debt that can be converted into equity or shares of the company if the stock price hits a certain level. It's kind of a hybrid instrument.
Right, right. And the interesting thing here is that they're using zero coupon bonds, which means they don't have to make those regular interest payments. So it frees up more capital for them to, well, buy more Bitcoin.
Exactly. And what's really clever is they're structuring these bonds with pretty high conversion premiums.
Oh, right, right. That means that for those bondholders to actually convert their bonds into shares, the stock price has to climb pretty significantly.
Yeah, it's like, they're not giving away those shares for nothing.
Mhm.
It really has to be worth it for the bondholders to make that conversion.
And it kind of protects the existing shareholders too, right? I mean, it limits how much their ownership gets diluted.
Absolutely. It's a really strategic way to manage that balance between attracting new investment and safeguarding the interests of current investors.
So, like, the article mentioned their bond offering back in November 2024, where they raised $3 billion, right? And that had a conversion price of $672 per share, which was a full 55% premium over their stock price at the time.
Right. So you can see there's a lot of interest in this strategy. It's clearly attracting investors, particularly those institutional investors who are looking for, unique and potentially high yield opportunities.
But of course, it's not all smooth sailing. There are definitely risks involved, especially with something as volatile as Bitcoin, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest risk is probably if their bet on Bitcoin doesn't pan out. If the price of Bitcoin doesn't rise enough, or if it crashes, they could be left holding a lot of debt and their valuation could take a major hit.
And then those convertible bonds, well, if the stock price doesn't reach that conversion price, that debt just remains debt, right? They've got to figure out a way to pay it back.
It's a high stakes game for sure.
It is. But it's definitely a fascinating one to watch.
I mean, that's the core of their strategy, right? They're not looking to just, make a quick buck off this Bitcoin trend. They really seem to believe that this is the future.
Yeah, they're playing the long game here, right? Betting that Bitcoin will eventually become like a major part of how the whole financial system works.
Right. And it's that long-term view,
Mm,
I think, that helps them manage some of those risks we talked about. Because, Bitcoin, it's going to be volatile. There are going to be ups and downs. But if they're in it for the long haul.
yeah, they can ride those waves out a bit better.
Exactly. And the article pointed out something I thought was interesting. They mentioned those high conversion prices on the bonds as a way to minimize dilution for the existing shareholders.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
So it's like they're being responsible. They're not just,
Yeah.
issuing tons of new shares and potentially harming the people who've already invested in them.
Yeah, it shows they're thinking about all sides of this equation, not just, how much Bitcoin they can accumulate.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
really strategic.
Almost like they're creating a whole new financial model. I mean, is this something we might see other companies doing, especially as more and more companies start getting into crypto?
I think it's definitely a possibility. You know, MicroStrategy is kind of a trailblazer here. They're pushing the boundaries of what's considered normal in corporate finance.
Yeah, and other companies are definitely watching to see how this all plays out.
It's like they're setting a precedent right, showing that it's possible to not just invest in Bitcoin, but to make it a core part of your entire financial strategy.
And it's not just about other companies getting inspired either, right? I mean, what MicroStrategy is doing is having a real impact on the whole crypto ecosystem.
Right. It's like they're putting their money where their mouth is right. They're not just talking about how much they believe in Bitcoin. They're
Mhm.
actually backing it up with their actions.
And by holding on to so much Bitcoin, they're sending a signal to those big institutional investors that Bitcoin is an asset worth taking seriously.
Exactly. And don't forget about supply and demand, right? The more Bitcoin MicroStrategy buys and holds onto, the less there is available for everyone else.
Which could drive the price up even further.
It's a fascinating dynamic.
It really is. And it leads to this big question, right? Is this something other companies can actually replicate? Is MicroStrategy's playbook something others can follow? Or is it just too unique to Bitcoin and to MicroStrategy's specific circumstances?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Hmm.
I mean, their strategy has definitely been working for them so far, but it's still relatively early.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out over the long term.
Because the success of this strategy depends on a lot of things, right?
Right.
Like how much Bitcoin continues to grow and be adopted, what happens with regulations, the overall stability of the crypto market.
It's a bold experiment, no doubt about it.
But no matter what happens, I think MicroStrategy's story is a really interesting example of how companies can adapt and innovate in a world where things are changing so quickly.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, it really is. And it's exciting to watch. They're not just passively investing, they're really like shaping their own future and maybe even like influencing the future of finance in general.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's what makes them so interesting to follow. They're not afraid of the volatility or the uncertainty that comes with crypto. In fact, they seem to be using it to their advantage. It's like they're playing a different game.
It's almost like they're thinking on a different timeline, right? Like instead of focusing on quarterly earnings, they're thinking about the next decade or even longer.
Exactly. They get it. They understand that real innovation, the kind that really changes things, takes time, and you got to be willing to ride out the bumps along the way.
And in doing so, they're not only changing how we think about corporate finance, but also how people view Bitcoin, right?
Right. It's like they're saying, hey, this is a serious asset class. And by putting so much of their own money into it, they're giving other institutions the confidence to maybe start doing the same thing.
So just to kind of recap what we've been talking about today, MicroStrategy is using some pretty unconventional tactics like share dilution and these creatively structured convertible bonds to build up a massive Bitcoin treasury.
Right. And it all hinges on this belief that Bitcoin is going to keep going up in value. And so far, it seems like their bet is paying off.
It is, but it's also a risky strategy, right? There's no guarantee that Bitcoin will keep going up, and if it doesn't, they could be in a tough spot.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of risk involved. And that brings us back to that big question we were talking about earlier. Can other companies follow their lead? Is MicroStrategy's approach a blueprint for the future? Or is it too unique to them and to the specific nature of Bitcoin?
What do you think is the most interesting thing about their strategy?
Well, I think it's their willingness to embrace uncertainty. In a world where everyone is obsessed with minimizing risk and maximizing short-term profits, they're doing something totally different. They're thinking long-term, and they're betting on the transformative potential of Bitcoin, even though it's still, relatively new and unproven asset. It's a good reminder that sometimes you have to take risks to achieve big things.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a pretty powerful message.
And for our listeners out there, this brings up an interesting question. Could you apply any of MicroStrategy's strategies, or at least the principles behind them, to your own financial decisions? It's something to think about as you navigate this, constantly changing world of finance and technology.
So that wraps up our deep dive into MicroStrategy.
Fascinating company.
Definitely one to keep an eye on. Thanks for joining us today, everyone, and we hope you enjoyed this conversation. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep learning. The future of finance is being written right now, and it's an exciting time to be a part of it. Take care.
Yeah.